Hello everybody. So to talk about the faux stone technique. So first I want to quickly show you guys a few of my crystals and just talk about what makes a good crystal to try and imitate and what doesn't. So this one is a purple watermelon fluoride. So as you can see, it's a very dark stone. There is lighter inclusions, and if you have light that shines directly through it, you can see a bit more depth. But this is an example of a stone that is very difficult to imitate, and if you do, it's not going to have a very striking effect. It's just going to look like, I don't know, dirty clay. However, in the purple range, this is a piece of amethyst. So as you can see with the light coming through it, there is a lot of lines and light pieces and dark pieces, which is a great look to try and imitate with something like transparent clay and alcohol ink. This is a piece of golden hematoid. The lines you can see is mostly orange. So if you were to use something like transparent clay with either orange alcohol ink or even orange paint, you will get a very similar looking effect at the end of the day. And depending on how small you cut your pieces, you can even get these sections that looks a bit more shattered than what it does on the other side. This is also a great example of what to imitate. I'm not exactly sure what this stone is. I bought it as a palm stone trio and it was just a palm stone trio. But what you can do is make use of Fimo's jade clay in order to get almost exactly this color, and then some white paint. I'm actually going to try and imitate this one. And then this is another one of the trio. That's a good example of something to try and imitate. This would be great for the translucent clay and alcohol ink effect. I'm going to be covered two types, so yeah, I'll show you guys what I mean with the difference. But yeah, as you can see, there's see-through sections with the lines of color coming through, which is a great effect to try and imitate. So then talking about clays. You do have types of clay that helps you to imitate stone. So this is Fimo's jade. This is the, I think it's glacier blue or something like that. And this is the rose quartz. These clays are semi-translucent, so they're not 100% translucent, but they do color a little bit. They carry a bit of color. So when you bake it, it has this like stone-like effect. You also get something like Sculpey's opal, which has these little plastic inclusions to get that flashes, but the rest of the clay is fairly whitish translucent. So you could then mix this with other stuff in order to get a really nice effect. Then you need your things you're going to mix it with. So I typically use this type of paint because it has a fairly high viscosity. It's just a personal preference. You can use absolutely any acrylic paint. I know some people are very partial to the dollar range that you can get from nearly everywhere, including Westpac, surprisingly enough. Then there's alcohol inks. I've got two colors I'm going to be working with today, purple and the wild plum look. This one's actually called amethyst. Funny. So yeah, I'm going to be working with these two clays. It's nice to have two colors. It's nice to have two colors that's fairly close to each other in range, because otherwise you'll when you squish it together, they might mix and then create a funky color. So if you have, for example, a green with a red or something like that, it might not have the effect that you want it to, because it's not like with the stained glass window effect where the alcohol inks stay completely separate. Then I also have a little bit of liquid clay here. This one's black. So I'm going to try and make turquoise with this one actually. I've preconditioned my pieces of clay, so I've got a bit of the Fimo jade here. This is a bit of the turquoise from Sculpey. Wow, it looks blue on camera, not turquoise. I promise this is turquoise. And then I have two pieces of translucent here. I'm going to be doing different effects with them. So one is a more cutting kind of thing and one is a more layering kind of thing, but they have completely different looks. So the reason I'm doing that is so that you guys can see the finished product, because it's very difficult to envision what it's going to look like if somebody just tells you, you know? Okay, so the first thing that you're going to have to learn to do is you can roll your conditioned clay into a little log. So I typically do it like that. Then you'll see on either end there might be a little bit of a gappy. From the middle outwards, squeeze that together so that you don't get any trapped clay. So take your time, work your way through to the ends before forming that into a bit of a log. So you can squeeze it like that and then roll it. Okay. For the stone-like effects, what you need is sharp edges. So I know that we're making a round shape right now, but once it's into a bit of a thinner log, you'll see what we're going to do is take our tissue blade or a craft knife and cut at all sorts of different angles, because that effect now, you'll see it creates irregular shapes with sharp spaces. Don't be scared to like cut in all sorts of weird spaces, and if you cut a piece that you already cut, that's also fine, and go through like that with your entire log. Now pieces are all cut, well, the pieces I want to be cut. So for the messy type of technique, so the paint and the liquid clay, I like to use a little glad baggie. So just these normal plastic baggies you can get from the supermarket. So what I do with this is I roll the open end so that it makes like a little bucket, one could say. Then put your clay inside, or your cut up pieces, being careful not to squish them too much as you move them around, because then they will start to adhere to each other. Then for this one, I'm going to be putting the black liquid clay in. Let's just move this out of the view. Here we go. The amount is a bit of a, you need to get used to it and play with it. I like to cover it to such a degree that in my mind I can imagine the liquid being able to coat every surface of the clay pieces inside. And once that's done, roll it up a little bit and then squish it about. So some people like doing this with gloves or with their bare hands. I dislike the feeling of doing it with my bare hands. It is a bit more difficult inside of the packet, because as you can see, the clay is wanting to make little bubbles of each other. So you need to squish with a light touch, if that makes sense, in order to get it to cover every piece. So if I open up there, you can see now there's a right sure mess going on inside there. If you feel you need to add a little bit extra, feel free to do so. I'm going to add just a bit more and then carry on. Okay, now once that's all good and covered, you can see there's a good mess going on there. What I like to do to protect my usual typical work surface, which is at the moment this very large tile, is to take a smaller tile and then take a piece of cling wrap and just pull it out so it covers the tile. There we go. There's our piece of cling wrap. And then I tip out this messy clay onto the cling wrap. It takes a bit of working to get all the small pieces to loosen from the packet, but that's because I don't want to go in there and grab with my bare handy hands. There we go, that's everything. Now make sure to roll down your packet, because otherwise that mess that's inside is going to touch other things and make more mess. I typically knot the end to contain the mess, shall we say. Right, so here's our clay. Now it's on our little cling wrap. So now you can bring them closer together and squish them a bit like this in order to start forming a log. So open up and squish your cling wrap bit by bit and keep working it until it forms one big log. There we go. So I'm just going to fold this over to contain the mess and then repeat that with the jade, except with paint. That's actually a good teaching moment. So you guys can see here on this side, it looks like it's quite goopy with the paint. So that is because I used too much paint. It's a symptom of using the small amount of jade and the paint that just glooped out. Luckily, because we are using these mess containers, they're going to take off quite a fair bit of the paint, which is great. We'll just have to work at it a bit. See, there you can see exactly why it's not good to have too much paint. You see how the paint gloops out there? That means the clay is not going to adhere to each other too well. And I'm just going to roll it and squish it to work out a bit of that goopiness. Right, I think that's about as much as I'll be able to work out. So I'm going to contain this mess. Now with the acrylic clay, you need to let it sit open in order to get dry, because you should only be cutting this log when it's a little bit tacky dry. So not quite 100% dry, but not quite as wet as this. So while that's drying, let's do the alcohol ink one. So this one, it's a bit harder to avoid the mess. I don't like using my hands for this, so I'll be using a paintbrush, because to get alcohol ink off your hands is nightmare. I do recommend using a smaller tile rather than your usual work surface, because alcohol ink can sometimes stain stuff. The ceramic tile is less likely, but if you're working off of something like a work mat or something like that, you're not going to have a good time. Cool. So I've separated my clay here into two piles. I'm going to just drop a few drops of alcohol ink on the one, and then on the other. Then take my dedicated paintbrush. I've got two. So you can see my paintbrushes here has been fairly discolored by the alcohol ink over the time. Alcohol ink doesn't come out of stuff, like, really. And then just squish them around to get the alcohol ink to cover as much of the surface as you can. You don't necessarily want it to cover absolutely everything in the same way, which is the beauty of this technique. You want different colorations in different spaces. You can use your brush to squish the pieces apart, to paint some of the pieces. But yeah, as you can see, because we don't want a full 100% coverage, using the bag method with this is not going to be perfect, because the bag method will want to have homogeneous coverage on everything. So I'll be squishing these guys for a bit now and get back to you. Righto, now as this one is going to dry on the side here, like everything else, I'm going to bring in this too. So these two have been rolled out on a fairly thin setting on my pasta machine. It was a number 6 for me. The reason for that is because we're going to paint the surface of these and then layer them on top of each other in order to create similar effect to this kind of thing. Okay, so again I'm going to be using the pink and the purple. So I'm just going to do the one and then the other. So what I usually do is I drop a few drops and then I use a brush to smooth it out. Again, don't be too concerned about consistent coverage, as long as you just cover all the way to the edges, which again could be a little bit messy. Alright, now while that dries, well, we're going to set it aside just now. I just want to point out, as you can see, it isn't a consistent coverage. There's definitely sections that's darker, sections that's lighter, sections that's a bit more streaky. But the important part is that the color goes all the way to the edges, because otherwise you're going to get sections where the color sort of just stops. Right, setting it aside to dry. And then bringing back our liquid clay one. There we go. Okay, I think I'm going to roll this one out onto my work surface. It's going to be messy, but that's the thing of this technique, innit? Let go, buddy. Okay, now what we're going to be doing is to slice into these and expose the insides. Okay, So now with the liquid clay technique, because you don't have to put a backing on this, you'll see your ends have the color covering on the ends. So you can either use that or throw them away, depending on whether you would be okay with having a color section on the back of something. You can take that covering off with acetone after it's been baked, so there's options available to you. So then opening these up and then laying them face up any which way they want to be fitting. Oh, so messy. Let me just move you guys a bit down. There we go. Okay, so now you can see, because my fingertips is dirty, wherever I pressed down or touched, I made little marks. This is perfectly fine. We're going to be taking it off with acetone afterwards, because with the liquid clay version, because you can't stop, well, it doesn't become dry. It does make for a stronger effect though, but because it doesn't become dry, this kind of thing is virtually unavoidable, because now we need to roll it down. And yeah, I'm just going to be cleaning up here a little bit. Okay, take my guide sticks and roll this down. I don't like putting the stone effects through my pasta machine, because it makes this paint mess everywhere, and to clean that is a literal nightmare. Okay, one direction. So these are 3mm sticks going down to 2mm, because that is better for stitch markers. Okay. Cool. I'm just going to see if this works. I have the brainwave literally now. Okay, let's see. Oh, that's interesting. It does work quite a fair bit. Just be careful if you... Well, what I'm doing now is I'm wiping the surface with a wet wipe. If you do this, you're going to get a bit of a streaky kind of effect. But I have a suspicion the back side of the slab is not as dirty as this. Okay, cool. Interesting. You can clean it up with a wet wipe a bit, but it does create quite a fair bit of streaks. So let's see what the back side of this looks like. Oh, it's very sticky. I can tell you that much. Oi. Ooh, it's looking not as good. I'm just going to lay that back down again and take that piece away. Oh, it's so messy. Okay. It's yeah, let's move on to the other one. I think that's going to be better. I'll cut that out and bake it separately. Okay, so coming to our jade piece. Here we go. Now with this one, I'm just quickly going to roll out a piece of translucent for a backing. I'll explain just now. Okay, I've rolled out a piece of translucent on number 6. As you can see, it's very thin, which is what we need. So now, the reason for the backing is with the paint method, the clay is not adhering to clay in order to stick together with this method. So you need the backing in order to keep the clay together a bit better. Once these pieces are baked, I'll show you some of my older pieces where I didn't use the backing so that you can see the difference. So cutting these and laying them down. So as you can see with our too much clay, it is creating that paint bubbles. I was fully expecting that. It also goes to show that the paint isn't 100% dry, it's just starting to become tacky kind of thing. Okay, just cut this a little bit to a more manageable piece. Okay, and then move this bad boy a bit closer. Okay, so I'm going to be using my guide sticks to roll down again. So first the 3mm ones. Doesn't want to stick, it wants to stick to the roller rather than the bottom. Oof. Oof. There we go, buddies. Okay, just the 1, then down to a 2. Okay. Sure. The paint is incredibly messy. Make sure to clean your tools as you go along, because to try and clean them afterwards is nearly impossible, especially with these acrylic kind of stuff. Once the paint dries, you'll have to use acetone to get it off, which will cloud your acrylic, which is not what you want. Okay. Let's see if we wipe down a small section of this whether it's also going to do the... this doesn't do the smearing thing as much, maybe because I'm not going as hard on them. Okay. I'm gonna clean up here and come back to you guys. Righto, I've cleaned up nice and clean, and I've had breakfast, so now we're back with part 2 of the same video. So I'm quickly going to do the layering one before I do the chippy one with the translucent clay, and yeah, then we take it from there. So with the layering one, what you want is sort of like a Magumagana effect, except that you don't push anything into anything. So I'm just going to lift these clays. Cut that one accidentally. Come on, my friend. It's a bit easier if you're not trying to do it in a way that is visible on the camera, eh? If they tear and such, it's not a problem, so I'm going to lift this section up now. What I'm going to do is layer it over the purple. Try and not get any air bubbles trapped in there though. That will be the pits. And then even if they overlap a little bit, it's fine. As long as you can cover as much of the surface as you can. Turn this one a bit. Cut it a bit. Oop. There we go. There we go. So it doesn't have to be absolutely full coverage, that's perfectly fine. Then I'm going to cut this one roughly in half, lift up the one half, and layer it again. Then you essentially keep doing that until it starts forming sort of a block. You don't have to be absolutely clinically perfect with this. The less perfection, the better the look actually. You can also just lift up the entire piece and tear off small pieces and layer it over each other over and over. That's also a strategy. Oop. There we go. Right, that's about enough of a block. So now if I lift this one and show you guys the sides, you'll see there's these layers that's busy forming, but the edges aren't perfect. They're a little bit imperfect, which is exactly what we want. Because now when you press it together to form a log or a cane, all of those imperfections is going to make the lines shift. See, like what happened there, which is exactly what we want. Try and keep it more lengthwise rather than squishing it flat. You can also push it closer and closer together, which will cause that interesting shifting. Push it down again, push it closer again. I hope my down and closer makes sense, since I'm turning this every which way and it could be interpreted any which way. This method is a little bit less messy, as you can see on my hands. There's no residue coming off of this because we waited until the alcohol ink is completely dry before starting with this. And there we go. So I'm going to take this tile away. and then cut open some slices. Let me just wipe my blade here. So now you see you've got that interesting layering type effect happening. So you see here where you've got some pinks touching over there, you've got this happening over there. It's all perfectly fine, because what we're going to do now is lay all the lines in the same direction and then roll it down to our desired width. So if I can show you with my stones, you see all the lines go in a similar direction. This is what we're trying to imitate. And even with something like this, it looks like all the lines go to every different way, but with this particular method, because it's lines, if you have something going this way and then something all of a sudden turning that way, it's not going to look like natural stone. Natural stone with these thin lines tend to all traverse in the same direction. So if we take first our 3mm sticks, roll that down a bit. If it squishes and distorts, what's going to happen as well with the translucent clay, I'll show you guys with this section specifically. If it squishes and distorts like that, what will happen is that the bottom of the lines will stay roughly in the same position, but then the tops shift into a different direction. So you would have this really interesting sort of dimensional shift in the lines if the light plays through it. But I'll definitely show you guys what I mean once it's baked. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to cut this and show you guys the other side as well. Right, these are my scraps. So if I cut them open, you will see the lines now goes in every which direction, but it's a lot more organic than having strong corners this way or that way. Beautiful. I actually like this side more than the other side. Doesn't it look like a geode over there and here? Wow. So pro tip, what I usually do with skeletons if they start getting this small is that I stick them onto my baking tray just like this, because your skeleton, even though like this section is a bit, looks like clay that's barely connected, it is a good test to see whether your clay has baked correctly, because once it comes out you can just bend and twist the skeleton rather than bend and twist a piece that you want to actually use. Right, next up we have our pieces. So now, once again, as you can see, it's all differently colored, differently connected. Well, not connected, but different hues. So I'm just going to loosen them and then mix them together a bit. So this one can sometimes be a little bit messy on your fingers, because there's sections of the clay that isn't exposed to air while you're waiting for it to dry, which means that the pigment that's trapped in those sections would potentially be not as stuck to the clay as the rest of them. But luckily it would come off your fingers with a bit of acetone very quickly. You mix them pretty good and then you squish them into a log. Once they're squished into log form, at least, it tends to be slightly less messy. So I'm just going to move this aside and then continue squishing. So you can see there's still a bit of color coming off there, but not so much on my palm that I'm using to squish with. Okay, I'm just going to clear off this blade so I don't cut color into it. Clean this off. Clean my fingers off a bit. There you go. So now, if we cut this open, you will see it creates that lines of color that we're after, but in a bit of a different form than what we did just now, because there's a lot more clear translucent clay in between all the areas. So then if we roll it down, what I do find a lot more pleasing about alcohol ink versus paint or liquid clay is that it's a lot easier to see your lines on the surface, because they don't smoosh about. That's what the clay does of the paint. Right, beautiful. I'm going to cut that out quickly. Just let me lift the slabby off. Okay. So now this is actually a good example. You see this and that was the two ends of the clay. I'm happy to leave them like that, because this will be my front. But if you don't like them, it would be better to either discard them or cut them as thin as possible so the discarded amount is minimized. All my bits and bobs are ready for the oven now. I'm just going to quickly bring them in here. There we go. So, to talk through everything we've got here. Here we've got jade with white paint. Then we have Fimo. Fimo jade with white paint. Primo turquoise with black liquid clay. Then these are all translucent with alcohol ink effects. These are the first iteration of the stripy effect, the second iteration, and the third iteration here. These ones are with the chipped effect, first iteration, second iteration, third iteration, these little smushy ones over there. Okay, so I'm going to stick these in the oven and be back when they're done. And we're back with all the baked pieces. Apologies in advance, my hubby is busy playing games in the background, so if you hear him, I'm sorry. Okay, so from bottom to top, this is our Primo turquoise with liquid clay, the Fimo jade with white paint, the translucent clay with the chip technique, and then the translucent clay with the layer technique. So first of all, I'm very disappointed in the colors of this too, because what they look like pre-baked and what they look baked is very different, which is something I am struggling with a lot, trying to figure out what the color of the baked look is going to be, because as you can see, the pink is absolutely nothing like the original color. I have a feeling that pinks and reds discolor a lot more than what your cooler colors do, because I've got another color that is it's this flamingo pink kind of look, but when it's baked it's just like bright neon orange. So yeah, it's very weird. What I do like about these pieces though is how they reflect in the light, so I'll show that once I've talked about the acetone thing. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of residue on the top of these pieces, but it's a very small amount of residue. So what you could do is just use acetone. I use this 100% acetone from Planet Nails on a bit of an ear buddy and just clean them up ever so slightly. Okay, so something I do want to cover before we move on is that, remember I told you guys to put a thin layer of translucent or any other clay actually at the back of these. With translucent you don't see it as much. There's a bit of paint that went through. You don't see it as much. You can still see the stone effect coming through at the back of your pieces. If you don't, however, it ends up like this. So as you can see, this is a much thicker piece. Well, not much, but it is a thicker piece. However, it is extremely brittle. With just the clay being held up by paint, you'll see it breaks. You see there, right on that paint line is where it will pull apart. So having that backing layer really helps to keep these pieces together so that they don't do that. So I'm just going to flex it a little bit. So you can see that it wants to, but because it's got that thin little bit of clay backing, it makes a world of difference. So I'm going to continue cleaning up my turquoise pieces now. So with the liquid clay, it will be a little bit harder getting that top layer off. And I think because we did the wiping thing, they remain fairly smoothie. I think I'm going to call these turquoise pieces a fail. That said, however, I did do the same with them as what I did with these translucent ones on camera, and I just want to show what they ended up with because they're quite interesting. So they look like this, where it's less smudgy. So I do think maybe what it comes down to is just using less amount of liquid clay or paint. Maybe I'm using too much. That's entirely possible. This is not a technique that I'm an expert with. So in closing, I want to show you guys how the light looks through these things. Okay, I brought you guys outside. So these are the pieces just as is, and then if the light shines through them, they look like this. Isn't that just such a stunning effect? Oop. Beautiful, eh? And that's it, guys. Thanks for joining me on this make-along journey. If there's anything that I can do differently, please let me know. I did notice while editing the video that there's quite a lot of shadows over my hands and such, so I'm considering maybe adjusting my desk so that the light from the window is more from a natural angle. But yeah, otherwise let me know if you guys try this. It's going to be exciting. Cheers.